The young woman greeted her friend, who had arrived in the auditorium a little earlier. He was delighted to see the companion with whom he enjoyed chatting. She reminded Jaemin that a small party was soon to take place. Of course, he also planned to attend, eager to drink and enjoy some good food. Suddenly, a red-haired guy appeared in the auditorium, capturing everyone's attention. He was popular and attended lectures with Jaemin and his friend. The girl didn't hesitate to approach him directly to invite him to the party. However, he hesitated, unsure of how to respond, as he really wanted to join the celebration, but couldn't do so without the involvement of his acquaintance for a particular reason. Therefore, before giving an answer, he needed to call his friend. So he left the auditorium to find a more secluded place. The others found his behavior odd. Though they didn't voice their assumptions aloud, they believed the two were a couple. Nakyung was quite displeased when she heard about the upcoming party. Though she was free that day and even mentioned it to her friend, she had planned to simply relax at home rather than go out drinking with others. Moreover, Minwoo often behaved poorly when he drank too much, once nearly revealing his true nature to others, which would have been very dangerous had his friend not been around. After he promised not to overdo it with alcohol, the girl finally agreed. This made the protagonist very happy, as he anticipated everything would go smoothly. But at the moment of the party, the guy no longer seemed as joyful, all because he wasn't feeling well and couldn't understand why. However, he wasn't drunk this time since he didn't want a repeat of any awkward situations. Moreover, the day when werewolves could reveal their true selves hadn't arrived yet. His friend was worried about Minwoo, seeing his condition, but he couldn't even answer what exactly was happening to him. At first, she thought he had just overindulged in alcohol again, but soon a few people entered the establishment from outside. They were talking about the beautiful full moon that night, and everything became clear. The protagonist and his friend were horrified by this realization. The girl immediately dragged her friend toward the exit to avoid any awkwardness. Those around them were visibly upset by the unfolding events. Jaemin, who was also at the party, observed the situation. He too wanted to step outside for a smoke, but found that he was out of cigarettes. After informing his friends, he decided to head to the nearest store to replenish his supply and smoke on the way. As soon as the student exited the 24-hour store, he glanced at the sky. The moon that night was indeed particularly beautiful, just as others had said. Suddenly, he heard the voices of his classmates coming from an alleyway. Their conversation was quite strange and seemed to make no sense. So he decided to go and check if everything was all right. Perhaps they needed help. But as he approached, Jaemin was horrified, even dropping his cigarette in shock. Standing next to the girl was not the protagonist, but a massive creature, resembling a strange red wolf, the likes of which are rarely seen in the city. Everyone involved in the situation was in shock, not knowing how to best explain what was happening. Things had taken a rather unfortunate turn. Jaemin screamed so loudly that it echoed through the entire block, but others reacted in much the same way. However, the boy didn't realize that he was facing a werewolf. He was merely astonished by the presence of a wild animal in the city. His reaction surprised both the protagonist and his friend, as they had feared a completely different response from him. The girl tried to explain that it was simply a breed of dog resembling wild animals, nothing more. Then the creature seemed very beautiful to him, and he even felt the urge to pet it despite its intimidating size. Nakyung deliberately allowed this, seeking a bit of revenge on her friend, as it was his own oversight of the date that had created this situation. As soon as Jaemin got permission, he began approaching Minwoo, who noticeably tensed up at this. However, when the boy started petting the wolf, Minwoo realized how pleasant it was and finally managed to relax. The girl then started teasing him, noting how much the wolf enjoyed what was happening. The protagonist didn't want to appear ridiculous or amusing, so he immediately decided to walk away and not prolong the embarrassing moment. The girl hoped not to reveal her friend's secret and decided to leave as well, as her so-called pet could no longer stand still. Jaemin remembered that he had earlier heard Minwoo's voice in that alley, which was very strange, considering he hadn't found him there after all. The protagonist's sister met him at home and was obviously displeased with the werewolf for wandering around in that form. The boy himself looked very grim and was clearly unhappy that he had forgotten such an important day for his kind. His friend also tried to defend him, arguing to the elder that nothing serious had happened in the end. He wasn't exposed, just petted like an animal. Nevertheless, the fact that someone had seen Minwoo in that form only frightened rather than reassured his sister. The protagonist didn't want to discuss it, so he headed straight to his room, not even letting his little niece in. Nakyung, left alone to endure the scolding for a mistake she hadn't even made, was understandably upset. Not wanting to linger in someone else's home without reason, the girl quickly said her goodbyes and hurriedly left. The elder seemed to calm down a bit and became more polite to her brother's friend, who had, after all, been a great help to him. Yet she was still troubled by the fact that the boy had locked himself in his room and didn't want to see anyone that night, which was very unlike him. Lying in bed, the protagonist reflected on what had happened before they both left. His true identity had almost been revealed. However, Jaemin had said it more as a joke, since in real life, people can't transform into animals. It's an obvious fact. It seemed that everything had ended well, but something continued to bother him, as there was no certainty that they had fully convinced the boy that werewolves didn't exist. The very thought irritated the wolf, as he couldn't find peace, lost in speculation about how his life might change now. In the end, he managed to convince himself that nothing bad might happen, and there was a chance that everything would turn out just fine. Then Minwoo remembered how good it felt when the boy's hand stroked his fur, and how brightly he had smiled at him. This initially brought him a sense of calm and tranquility, but soon he began to panic over his own feelings and the quickening of his heartbeat. In the end, he even found himself falling for the human, though he still didn't fully understand what had happened or why he felt so strange, unable to stop it. Meanwhile, Jaemin also returned home, managed to take a shower, and pondered over the events. He pulled out an item from his backpack that he had found earlier where he had parted ways with the girl and her pet. He had wanted to catch up with her to return the accessory, but couldn't, as she had disappeared from sight too quickly. Then he recalled having seen a similar item somewhere before, though it took him a moment to realize where exactly that had been. Suddenly, he remembered that Nakyung had been carrying her friend's backpack, which seemed very strange given all the other circumstances. So Jaemin decided to investigate his suspicions further and figure out who that wolf really was. After all, the accessory was a keychain that perfectly matched the appearance of the very unusual creature for city streets. The protagonist dreamed of being intimately close with the person who had almost uncovered his true nature, and he found himself surprisingly content with it. Only the alarm clock managed to interrupt this vision. He woke up abruptly, not immediately understanding what had happened or why he was even thinking about such things. Even on his way to the university, right there in the train carriage, Minwoo struggled to make sense of his emotions regarding the evening's incident. Though he had enjoyed being petted in his wolf form, it didn't justify such explicit fantasies. The whole situation seemed incredibly strange. What was even more surprising was that the werewolf kept recalling images from his dream, feeling deeply embarrassed by how Jaemin's body appeared in his thoughts. Nevertheless, such thoughts troubled him greatly, and he tried to push them away or simply force himself to forget that strange dream. That's why Minwoo was startled when someone suddenly tugged at his sleeve, as if they might have overheard everything he had just been thinking about. However, it turned out to be just his friend, who had been sitting next to him on the train and grew concerned when the werewolf became too lost in thought. At first, he didn't want to talk about that strange incident with the girl, but then he realized he could learn more about the person who now intrigued him. Unfortunately, she couldn't tell him much either, but at least she had the opportunity to speak with Jaemin's friend about it. Finally, the girl understood why her friend was so pensive and silent today. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She immediately realized that Minwoo had taken a liking to the guy he had accidentally gotten close to last night. This assumption shocked the protagonist, who had been afraid to even think about it. Yet here, his friend was saying it so openly. Nakyung then tried to encourage her friend, telling him he needed to be strong and muster the courage to approach the person he cared about first. In this regard, it would be good if he could take a page from his sister's book, who was never shy and always expressed her feelings boldly. Her intent was to motivate the werewolf not to give up in seeking his beloved's attention, even though he wasn't yet fully certain of his own feelings. Still, the girl was undoubtedly right in what she said, even if the boy didn't want to admit it. There was no denying it. Once Minwoo calmed down after her words, his friend realized that he had indeed fallen in love as a result of yesterday's events, and now it was impossible to hide. Nevertheless, such direct statements made the protagonist uncomfortable. He didn't want his friend to say these things out loud, but she wasn't ready to stop and began giving him advice on how best to win over the object of his affection. First, it would be a good idea to invite Jaemin to lunch, and during the meal, there would be an opportunity to start a more candid conversation. The werewolf didn't understand how she could talk so casually about something he was too afraid to even think about, knowing how awkward it would be. In the end, He couldn't outright refute her words, but he hoped to avoid it at least for that day, as he wasn't supposed to meet his crush. That's what he thought as he approached the auditorium. But his relief didn't last long, for when he opened the door, he realized how wrong he had been. Right in front of him stood Jaemin, who was leaving the room and seemed not at all opposed to meeting his classmate. Though the boy was surprised that Minwoo attended the same classes as he didn't express any negative feelings about it. After quickly greeting his crush, the young werewolf decided to escape as soon as possible, not wanting to prolong the increasingly awkward conversation. However, his friend wouldn't allow him to act so cowardly and quickly grabbed his backpack, pulling him back. In the end, Minwoo found himself sitting in the lecture, with his best friend on one side and the boy he had feelings for on the other. Of course, the protagonist felt incredibly awkward about it. He couldn't even recall when he started attending the same classes as Jaemin. Perhaps it was all due to his lack of attention when choosing subjects. Back then, it had been noisy, and he couldn't concentrate on the group lists. Now, it all led to him anxiously waiting for the lecture to end, hoping it wouldn't drag on for too long. Suddenly, without realizing it, he touched his crush's hand with his own and immediately jumped out of his seat with a yelp, as if shocked by electricity. At once, the red-haired boy felt embarrassed by his behavior. He apologized to the professor and quickly returned to his seat. Now, he tried to stay as close to his friend as possible to avoid any similar situations, while Jaemin seemed to have perked up a bit. Out of the blue, he passed a note to the protagonist, suggesting they go grab something to eat together after this boring lecture ended. This shocked the young werewolf. He couldn't understand the boy's motives. Just a day ago, he hadn't seemed interested in this interaction, and now everything had changed. His crush smiled, which didn't make it any easier to gauge the situation. It was still unclear why he wanted this lunch, as they weren't even friends. Though the situation was turning out in Minwoo's favor, he wasn't happy about it at all. What had happened frightened him more than it delighted him. Fortunately, the lecture ended soon, and it seemed that this awkward situation would also come to a close. Surprisingly, there was a lot of information, even though it was the first time the group had this subject that day. The protagonist was already thinking about how to gently decline the boy's invitation to lunch, as Jaemin clearly seemed serious. In the end, the only right decision seemed to be to lie, claiming that he had already promised his friend to have lunch with her and didn't want to break his plans. However, the girl didn't support this excuse, understanding well that her friend was simply trying to be cowardly again, which was clearly unnecessary. So, deciding not to stand in the way of potential lovers getting to know each other, she pretended to be late for a meeting and hurried off, leaving her friend all alone. Jaemin was pleased with how things turned out, even promising the girl that he would take good care of her friend. But Minwoo was horrified by everything that was happening. He grabbed the girl and begged her not to leave him alone. Yet she openly confessed that she was doing it on purpose, and in apology, promised to treat him to a meal later. After that, the protagonist's friend quickly left, leaving the two guys alone, one looking content, while the other remained terrified. While Jaemin walked over to the vending machine to get drinks, intending to at least bring something for their break, if not a full meal, the werewolf sat on the bench, unable to shake the feeling of awkwardness. Having only recently realized his feelings, he wasn't ready for such a personal encounter with his crush. His anxious thoughts were interrupted by the boy himself, who returned with cans of soda. Now there was no avoiding the conversation any longer. At first, Jaemin lit a cigarette, a habit he was used to, and as he brought it to his lips, the protagonist imagined what it would be like to kiss them. This made Minwoo even more embarrassed, causing him to avoid looking at his conversation partner, even though it seemed quite rude. Suddenly, he asked why they had gone to such a secluded place when they could have just eaten at a cafe. Surprisingly, Jaemin answered honestly, saying he just wanted to get away from everyone so no one could overhear them. At the same time, he seemed happy, as if he wasn't at all worried about what was happening, which struck Minwoo as very strange. Then, out of the blue, Jaemin started asking strange questions, as if they were on a first date, trying to see if they were compatible. He began by inquiring about Minwoo's personality type, then moved on to topics like his zodiac sign and other cliched questions for potential couples. It wasn't clear why such things couldn't be discussed in a cafe. After all, no one would judge them for that. Even friends talk about such matters. But the last question caught Minwoo off guard, as he had been so preoccupied with his own feelings that he had forgotten he could be exposed by his crush. The situation from that evening now left him with only pleasant and embarrassing emotions. There was no trace of fear, so he was truly caught off guard, even choking on his soda, unsure of how to react since he didn't want to reveal his true nature. He tried to play dumb, pretending he knew nothing about such creatures, but he didn't do a very good job. His initial reaction betrayed all his emotions. Then Jaemin decided to prove that he had actually figured out the truth that evening, realizing that he wouldn't get an honest answer any other way. After rummaging in his pocket for a bit, he pulled out the red wolf keychain, the same one he had found on the ground not too long ago. Though it had been dropped by the protagonist's friend, Jaemin was convinced that the accessory belonged to Minwoo and served as proof of his connection to the werewolf race. At first, Minwoo thanked him for finding the item, not fully considering the implications it carried. However, he then started wondering how the item could have ended up with his crush, given that he had met him in wolf form the previous evening. He tried to justify himself by claiming he had dropped it while hurrying home after the party, but it was an obviously weak lie, especially since the protagonist's bag had been in his friend's hands that evening. This detail was too suspicious. Minwoo himself felt incredibly strange, unable to comprehend how he could have been exposed by such a simple question. Of course, the protagonist feared what might come next, knowing that his crush could reveal what he had seen to everyone. Then the problem wouldn't just be about their relationship, but also the judgment of others that would rain down on the young werewolf once his secret was known. Jaemin suggested keeping everything a secret if Minwoo would get to know him very intimately, just as it had happened in his dream. Minwoo was deeply embarrassed by these words, and at first, he didn't even realize that the statement was indeed serious and directed at him. Of course, he had thought about something like this before, but it all happened too suddenly, so he couldn't just agree so easily. The werewolf wanted to protect his secret in another way, perhaps by offering financial compensation for keeping it or even treating Jaemin to dinner. But such a proposition seemed too humiliating. The words were clearly a threat, but they didn't evoke only fear in the protagonist. There was definitely something more. Then the protagonist made a decision, which he immediately conveyed to Jaemin. He would do whatever was necessary as long as others wouldn't learn his true identity. Naturally, it was impossible to say such a thing without blushing, and Minwoo's face turned bright red, while Jaemin seemed surprisingly taken aback by his response. The boy's reaction to the agreement was the most unexpected. He suddenly burst into laughter, unable to contain his emotions, and apologized to Minwoo. In truth, his words had only been a joke, but unexpectedly, they had made Minwoo seriously consider and even accept such a fate. The protagonist couldn't get over what his classmate had said. It seemed to him that everything was already inevitable, only to discover it was all just a joke. Jaemin found this reaction adorable and even wanted to say something similar again just to see that expression on Minwoo's face once more. The werewolf, however, was painfully aware of how much he had humiliated himself by taking such indecent suggestions seriously, and even agreeing to them. Seeing Minwoo's confusion, Jaemin wanted to support and comfort him, but unfortunately, the place they had chosen was becoming less private. So, after promising not to reveal the young werewolf's secret to anyone, Jaemin prepared to leave, intending to let Minwoo be alone with his thoughts. He was still struck by how seriously the protagonist had taken his words and must have considered him capable of doing such a thing to another person. That evening, Jaemin met up with one of his old friends at a cozy cafe, perfect for a casual get-together. The brunette was already waiting for him at the table and had even managed to order quite a bit of food, which might have seemed impolite, but they had agreed on it in advance. The older friend decided to order even more, ensuring they would have enough for the two of them, while Jaemin couldn't stop marveling at the fact that this meeting was happening at all. Most of the time, his friend was too busy for a simple meal together, but today, things had worked out well with his part-time job. The place where they were hanging out that evening was very close to the university, which became a source of jokes but not complaints. For a while, the younger one couldn't start the conversation. He just watched the meat cook and remained silent, lost in his thoughts. His friend found this behavior unsettling, as they hadn't seen each other in a while, and surely they could find topics to discuss rather than sit in silence. In truth, Jaemin felt guilty about the situation with Minwoo. It seemed as though he had tried to coerce him into something unpleasant in exchange for keeping his secret. So he decided to discuss it with his friend, without mentioning names or the specific details of what had happened between them. The older friend didn't know how to react. He was shocked by what he heard and really hoped that Jaemin wasn't capable of such actions. Jaemin quickly turned it into a joke, explaining that he hadn't meant anything shameful or wrong by it. After that, he told his friend the whole story, how he had made the offer to Minwoo for silence and even received agreement, but then pretended he hadn't been serious. The brunette found this behavior odd, thinking that Jaemin was probably disappointed by abandoning his original plan. If he truly didn't want to do it, he wouldn't have threatened in the first place. However, Jaemin wasn't a cruel person and understood well that the protagonist might have a girlfriend, especially since he was always seen with one of the female students. He should have clarified that right away, but he hadn't even thought to do so, which was undoubtedly a big mistake. The older friend advised Jaemin to simply be kinder to the person he cared about, and that would surely help him win their attention. Jaemin tried to hint that not everyone would be thrilled by simple kindness, but in some way, the brunette was right. The boy decided to try to build a relationship with Minwoo, if only because he was attracted to his appearance, which was already reason enough to give it a shot. His friend understood that their approaches to relationships were quite different, making it difficult for them to truly understand each other. For Jaemin, it was hard to decide how to proceed since, in reality, romantic relationships didn't interest him at all. Besides, being a couple at university meant becoming the center of attention for everyone around them, which didn't appeal to him much. 3 years ago, Jaemin attended the freshman initiation ceremony and even performed a number that everyone enjoyed. His friend, sitting next to him, was in awe of his talent and couldn't stop praising him, paying no attention to the next performers. Suddenly, a strangely dressed guy took the stage, wearing a women's dress, completely unashamed of his appearance. Jaemin was shocked by what he saw, realizing that not many people would have the courage for such a bold act. This would definitely be talked about for a long time. The feminine outfit fit the performer perfectly, which was surprising, as finding such clothing that suits well is usually quite difficult. Jaemin couldn't take his eyes off the protagonist and noticed that he actually looked quite good, despite the comical nature of the outfit. Minwoo spoke in a way that matched his attire, like how cute girls usually introduce themselves, further enhancing the overall look. Jaemin watched him intently, noting every detail that seemed attractive in the person's body, as if even his actions didn't make the situation ridiculous or funny. The protagonist began his performance, explaining that he needed to finish quickly and return the dress to his sister before she noticed it was missing. He planned to perform a dance from a popular girl group, which certainly made for a memorable act. His movements were quite impressive, coordinated and even very close to the original, which was astonishing given his build. Jaemin observed the performance with admiration and even a bit of embarrassment, which was quite obvious to those around him. When his friends started making comments about it, Jaemin tried to dismiss any attraction he felt toward this person, even though he actually did feel it. Nevertheless, he couldn't stop thinking about this person, and he remembered the freshman's name after just one encounter. Later, when the event was over, he approached Minwoo, who was sitting alone in the corner of the room, and tried to start a conversation with him. The werewolf was delighted to make a new acquaintance and enthusiastically engaged with the classmate he had just met. The protagonist praised the boy's performance, convinced that his own act had been inferior, and even felt a bit envious of such skills. Jaemin, on the other hand, considered Minwoo's performance the best of all that evening. The boy's efforts during preparation had certainly paid off. However, he hadn't been able to completely remove his makeup after the performance, and a bit of lipstick still lingered on his lips. To help him with this, Jaemin gently ran his finger along the edge of Minwoo's lips, creating an awkward moment and making him blush even more. Seeing Minwoo's reaction, Jaemin felt embarrassed and immediately apologized for his seemingly presumptuous action. Suddenly, Minwoo's friends called for him, and he went to join them for a drink, politely saying goodbye to the person who had first approached him for conversation. Jaemin became even more convinced that this freshman was incredibly charming and wanted to get to know him better, hoping to build a relationship with him in the future. Now, after returning from his meeting with a friend, Jaemin reminisced about that day, feeling an even stronger attraction to the young werewolf. The next day, Jaemin met the older friend he still remains close with, marveling at how vividly he could remember that day. Thinking about how Minwoo had looked that day, Jaemin blushed and realized he might have regretted dismissing his own words earlier. Minwoo seemed very shy and innocent, judging by his reactions to certain words and actions. At the same time, his gaze was truly wolf-like, befitting a predator, somewhat frightening and dangerous. This reminded Jaemin of Minwoo's wolf form and the unusual eyes that Wolf had. After this, Jaemin couldn't understand why he had imagined such an image of Minwoo. It seemed that letting go of his feelings for this person wouldn't be so easy after all. Later on, the protagonist didn't talk to his crush, but they both exchanged strange glances. The tense atmosphere was felt by the entire group. It was clear that something had happened between them, but no one dared to bring it up. Only the boys' closest friends whispered about what was going on, though they didn't have enough information to form any real conclusions. At first, both were in a stupor, trying to figure out the best way to handle such a tricky situation, as it was crucial to understand their friends' feelings first. Therefore, each of them, with a mix of curiosity and frustration, decided to question their friend about what had happened, hoping to uncover the whole truth. Jaemin's friend was blunt and relentless in her questioning, convinced that the boys were hiding something from them. However, Jaemin was determined not to reveal anything, simply blaming his mood on exhaustion from a heavy academic schedule. He couldn't tell the real reason, as it would not only expose Minwoo's secret but also reveal Jaemin's own embarrassing thoughts. Suddenly, he noticed Minwoo being comforted by his friend, who approached him unexpectedly that day. It was unclear why Minwoo looked so sad as well, which worried Jaemin, though he tried to push the thought aside. Admitting his own concern would also mean acknowledging the feelings he was starting to have for the werewolf. Meanwhile, Minwoo sat in his seat, deeply immersed in anxious thoughts that wouldn't leave him. Suddenly, his friend came up to him, grabbed him by the neck, and demanded that he immediately explain what had happened between them during that lunch. He couldn't understand how she had figured out that things hadn't gone well and asked her casually, as if nothing was wrong, to which she immediately started pitying him, assuming that he had been rejected in his feelings. This would explain the strange atmosphere between the boys and Minwoo's reaction to her question. In trying to explain to his friend that nothing bad had happened between them, Minwoo began to analyze the situation more clearly. After all, Jaemin hadn't said anything hurtful, hadn't rejected or pushed him away. He had just made an awkward joke, which meant there was still a chance to mend their relationship. These thoughts made the protagonist feel happy, realizing he could try again to win the attention of the one he loved. His friend didn't understand the reason for his sudden joy, but didn't want to dampen the moment with more questions. She simply agreed with what he told her. After classes, Minwoo tried to arrange a meeting with Jaemin, but he couldn't make it happen, and the same thing occurred in the following days. Whenever he attempted to approach Jaemin, the latter would suddenly disappear, as if intentionally avoiding him the entire time. Even when he sent a message suggesting they spend time together, the werewolf received a polite refusal, with Jaemin citing how busy he was. Sometime later, the protagonist found himself in a bar with a few other female students, but without his best friend, who had to leave for family matters. That day, he decided to get drunk, just so he wouldn't have to think for at least one night about the person he was so deeply in love with, no longer denying it. In the end, 2 classmates had to drag him out of the bar. They didn't even know where to take him, as it was already quite late, and he was too drunk to explain where he lived. But the worst part wasn't that. His wolf ear began to appear, which meant he was on the verge of revealing his secret, not just to one person, but to the whole group. By coincidence, Jaemin happened to be passing by the area, and he had no intention of getting involved in whatever was happening there. However, the protagonist suddenly seemed more alert as soon as he sensed Jaemin nearby, catching up to him and stopping him, though he was in no condition to speak. Moreover, his wolfish nature began to manifest more strongly, making the situation dangerous, as he could be exposed to those around him at any moment. But the werewolf just clung to his beloved, not wanting to let him go, while Jaemin stood there, stunned and unsure of what to do in such a situation.